Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We have three great speakers today who are going to be covering the topic of the future of testing in medical device, as well as how AI and other resources come into play when working with such a highly regulated industry. Our first speaker is Zach Blodgett of QualiTest. Zach is a solutions engineer, and he'll be covering a bit about what QualiTest does, but mostly how to test in a highly regulated industry such as medical device. Following Zach will be Paul Spalita, Senior Manager of Test Engineering at Accuray, who will be diving into their current test setup as well as explaining how QualiTest and Eggplant were able to improve their test automation. And finally, Michael Giacometti, Director of Global Alliances and Partnerships at Eggplant, will be diving into really what Eggplant does and some of the details and nuances associated with how we were able to assist Accuray. We'll be finishing up with a Q&A at the end. If for whatever reason we run out of time and don't get to your question, we will do our best to follow up with you after the event. And now, over to Zach.
Thank you, Lexi. So as she mentioned, I am Zach. I'm part of the QualiTest group. My role is solution architect, and today I'm going to be giving you a high-level overview of who QualiTest is, what we do, and why we thought this webinar was a good idea to collaborate with all three of our companies. So the agenda for today is going to be the introduction. After that, I'm going to go over the best testing practices. This is going to be specifically for automation for medical devices. We're going to move on to challenges within a testing regulated environment. And then finally, we're going to be asking the question, why is automating medical devices so important? So just a brief introduction about QualiTest. We are the world's largest pure play software testing company in the world. We have over 3,000 experienced testing professionals across 12 different centers. We have them in the United States, the UK, India, some in Europe. We have some in California. We have San Diego, Bay Area, New Jersey, etc. We have an extensive list of clients from nearly every vertical, including SiriusXM, PS Fixer, Microsoft, Google, Carl Zeiss, etc. And like Michael will probably mention later on, one of our biggest clients or clienteles is medical device industry, as you'll find out with Accuray later. Moving on to the next slide, because we don't want to spend too much time on who QualiTest is. So on this slide, we see that we have best medical device automation practices. One thing to note is that generally everything here, except for one, is going to be something you can apply industry-wide. Most times when people think of medical devices, they think it's going to be very complex, mainly because of the device in testing scope. However, as we've noticed, most of the times the issue is with compliance and not much else. So the first point we have is that we're going to ensure that the test cases reflect business reality. Basically, all this means is we're going to go in there on every project and ensure that manually, when I run through this regression suite, what gaps can I find? What percentage of automation coverage is there? And then with that information, I'm going to set up a risk registry. And then obviously, we're going to use all this information to see if it does indeed reflect the business reality. After this, we're going to have a knowledge transfer. Again, this is pretty standard, but the difference for this one is that your SMEs might not be other testers. Well, they might be people who test, but it might be a doctor, it might be an engineer that's fixing the actual device itself. People that a company can just find or scrounge around because they have a release really quickly. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. Next point is understanding and meeting compliance criteria. Every company is going to be different, but you're going to need to look at the HIPAA compliance, FDA compliance. If there's any SOPs in place, all of this is going to be need to take into consideration. And finally, the prioritization of testing areas. What I mean here is actually there's going to be lots of different areas for testing, obviously, some more technical, some less. We want to initially go after the least technical areas in order to get the most ROI first. So something that is incredibly repetitive, that doesn't have a lot of technical or sensitive data, that's what we want to get written down in scripts first. We have challenges with testing in a regulated environment. First and foremost, and probably most important, is the security issues. This is going to tie in with the next point of compliance, but it's something obviously everyone needs to be aware of, whether that be network risks, access to environments, whether people are on-site or off-site, whether they're offshore, source control, implementation for code and documentation. All of these need to be taken into consideration when thinking of security. For compliance and documentation, audits are going to happen frequently, and this is more so around the medical device industry than it would be if I was testing a retail website. So it's going to be imperative that we make sure that documentation and that proper logging are important. In fact, most of the times when we're selecting tools for clients, one of the questions we get asked is, what is the level or the degree that we can see these logs? When can we see that someone ran a test? By who? How many times? This is all very important. And then there's a subpoint for validation plan, how the system is validating. This includes strategy, activities, timelines, responsibilities, etc. Next point, clients go-to-market opportunities. This one's pretty interesting. So a lot of times we've dealt with companies that want us to ensure them that we can have testing done not only in a timeline, but if something needs to get released right away. The reason for this is many times there are events, there are seminars, there are any number of these things where, let's take Accuray for example, you would go to sell your product. If compliance is not met, if the testing is not 100%, that can severely reduce your opportunity to sell. And it's not like these come every week or so. We're talking maybe once a year or maybe once every 3 years, the big event comes to your city. So it's very important to focus on that. And finally, unlike other areas for automation testing, again, let's go back to the retail example. If I'm testing a retail website that hosts 300 different websites because they're a parent company, most of your testers are not going to have a problem with that. It's something new, it's something interesting. However, we've noticed that there's a lot of burnout when it comes to testing in a regulated environment. And the reason for this is usually because you're verifying the same information over and over again. And this will lead to boredom, and this will lead to burnout. The final slide I want to talk about is what is so important about medical device. Obviously, the most important one to most people is going to be the cost. Like I said, doctors, engineers, PMs, they will be tasked with manually testing the devices if they don't have QA on hand. So the fact that you can have a software tester, which is obviously going to be much cheaper than your engineer or doctor, is definitely going to be a plus. Also, there's going to be more reliance on important team members. So these doctors, again, they will be able to go back to their own tasks. As far as the reduction for need for manual, in medical device environments, there are normally many dry runs that need to be done. Hence, automation is going to reduce that time. When people look into automation, the whole reason they're doing that is for main two reasons: ROI and reduct time. And obviously that goes into the third point of quicker turnaround time for defect fixes. If I have something set up in a CI/CD pipeline and I have these defects being pushed to Jira, let's just say, it's going to be a lot quicker than my manual tester entering this in every single time they do a regression run that takes 10 hours for them. The improved quality and consistency, this is pretty straightforward. The fact that this is going to be automated, you're not going to have user error. It's going to improve the quality. Data-driven insights, obviously you're going to be able to get these metrics from these automated tests. And finally, this is one of the most important ones I wanted to touch upon, that you can look at the other points and notice that they're pretty general to most automation projects. However, this last point, compliance failures that result in extreme outcomes. Best example I can give you is FDA class 3 medical devices. If I'm testing and I have a 95% pass rate, that won't matter if the patient dies. This type of testing requires near zero bug tolerance, hence why having automation for medical devices is so vital. So with that, that concludes the QualiTest portion of this. I'm going to hand this over to our folks at Accuray, and they will walk you through a demo.
All right, thanks, Zach. Paul Splitta here from Accuray, and what I have on the screen here is a demo of what we're calling Automated Clinical Day, and this is a automation test that's using Eggplant. In fact, right here you'll see Eggplant here running through much of this demo. And I think what I'll do is I'll kick it off and jump in at different points and maybe explain what's going on. So just a little background here. What you're looking at is the treatment delivery system up on the screen there. And the thing on the right is not terribly relevant. This is a test environment, so you have to forgive the clutteredness. But here's the key point. What you see going on here is Eggplant's doing some stuff. Things are happening on the screen here. And nobody's coming over and touching stuff right here, which would be the way for them to control the system manually, which is accessible during the automation, but no one's touching it. We are now, so people might have some concerns here, and I would just put out the idea that all of our standard safety concepts are in place when we're running a test like this. This is a system here. So let me talk a little bit about Accuray maybe, and then that'll give some context to what's going on here. So Accuray produces radiation systems for treating people, obviously, and primarily for treating cancer, although it's up to the doctors what they do with our systems. Just a little explanation here. We switched over, so now we're a little different camera to see a better view of the treatment delivery console that you see back here. But here's Eggplant still on the side. You can see what's going on. So we produce radiation systems, and when we're testing, there's a range of testing that we can do. We have environments where it's just software, pure software solutions for testing, but we also have environments, we call them bunkers, whereby the entire system is set up and there's actually radiation that can and actually is being delivered during any testing that's going on. So for us, this is kind of new and groundbreaking. I mean, we've done some automation in the past, but in more limited sense. Here we're actually driving the full user interface, and it's driving the full system. Further to the concept of risks, we had to, in order to make the automation work, we have to temporarily bypass some of the mitigations in the system, but since there's no patient on the table, those risks are not of a concern during the testing. But again, so one of those would be, normally you would have to be down here pushing buttons or moving the key, changing the key position on this console that you see on the bottom, just below the Eggplant window there. And with Eggplant running, it's driving the TDC, the treatment delivery system, directly and making it all happen. And the main purpose for this automation, I'll come back to the automation that you're watching here a little bit. The main purpose for this automation is to get through the scan, register, and treat portions of our workflow. So that's the primary workflow where we're treating the patient. And so when a patient comes into the room, they get laid down on the couch is put into some starting position, and then the system will scan them. So that's an aspect that's interesting in the tomotherapy system. It's actually able to scan the patient live and see where they're at, and make sure that they're in the right spot so that we're treating exactly, putting the radiation exactly where we want it to be. So that's part of the scan process and registration. And what you're seeing here is, you might notice that we're actually up in the treat tab of the user interface. And so what's being driven here by Eggplant is we're actually driving the treatment portion of the delivery system as if there was a patient there. Of course, there's no real patient. There's just what we call a phantom on the table, which is, in this case, some plastic artifact. It's made to look like a human or some part of the human. So with that, I'll just let this continue running and maybe talk a little bit further about our story, if that makes sense. So our story actually goes back several years. We started looking at automation several years ago, and we looked at some different products on the marketplace. And so what this is going to lead up to is, what did we land on Eggplant? And so we tried some different technologies going back several years. They all were based on the standard automation concept, though, in the industry. The main concept that you see in the Windows environment, which is it's kind of a gray box concept where you're looking a little bit under the hood of the software that you're testing, and it's good for a lot of problem spaces in the software testing arena. Let me just pause here in that dialogue and just mention here. So what you're seeing on the screen here is the system is about to actually drive that couch. So now we've switched over to a video of the closed circuit TV camera that's in the room. Again, this is a cluttered testing environment because there's all kinds of experiments going on. So you wouldn't see this in an actual clinic. However, the system is actually delivering radiation right now, and that's denoted by that little monitor on the far left there, whereby it's showing you these numbers, and that's a measurement of the radiation being delivered. And you can also see in the user interface, even though it's a little bit obscured here, as that bar grows, that's showing that the radiation is being delivered. And it's showing you the level of completeness. So that's something that the operator would be observing during treatment of an actual patient. So we looked at those tools. We even used some of them, going back to the automation concept here. So we actually looked at those tools. We even used some of them, the standard tooling of looking under the hood a little bit of whatever you're testing, and that's good for certain things. But if you're using a lot of custom code, which I think is you're going to find that in certain medical devices, it becomes a little hard for those standard automation tools to interact with the product under test. And so this was a key concept here for Eggplant, why we adopted Eggplant. So we tried these other systems, these other tools, and then we were engaging with QualiTest. We'll bring QualiTest in here because they're part of our narrative. We were engaging QualiTest on the manual testing side of things, and that was very successful. And that was multi-site, Wisconsin and California. And then as that big project started to wrap up, then we shifted over into a couple of different modes. One, we changed the level for the manual testing and started ramping up and moving into a different project. At the same time, we took some of the resources off of that first project and we reallocated them to a proof of concept for automation. So we're making that transition, and we took some of those resources and moved them over into the automation, and we were doing this proof of concept. And as we were at the inception of that proof of concept, the main QualiTest contact was pushing, his name was Yuval, and he was pushing for Eggplant. And initially I was very reticent to even explore the tool. He was explaining to me what the tool is. It's a UI-based tool, et cetera. And me coming from more of a hardcore automation background with the hardcore tools, as it were, I heard that and I thought, oh, that doesn't sound very interesting. But he was very convinced, and so he convinced me to at least get a demo. So I got a demo of Eggplant, and it was very impressive. And it spoke to the concerns, some of the concerns, the technical concerns that I bring to automated testing from a medical device perspective, including having a light footprint on the system under test, being able to test against any operating system, being able to test against any software system, and being able to test like a user. So all those things were very appealing. And reflecting back on the experience we had with the other tools, one of the big concerns that we ran into, and I mentioned it earlier, alluded to it earlier, is we have a lot of custom code. Standard tools, a little bit under the hood tools, they were having trouble connecting up with some of the stuff on the screen, and it created big holes in our testing, in our automation approach. Okay, so that was one issue. I'm also going to just kind of digress a little bit and talk about another issue that we encountered with our earlier approaches. And this is more of a generic automation concept. We kind of shot wide, and we wanted to get a really big framework in place, and we wanted to have a whole bunch of test cases in place, and we didn't really get very far with that. We ended up, because of the technical issues, we ended up kind of getting into a mode of constantly looking at new solutions. We were still within the same tooling architecture, but we were looking at different ways to solve a lot of different technical problems, and we kind of got into this loop of just constantly exploring things, and it became like a research project almost, and that kind of fizzled out, And then we skip ahead, and now here we are. We're working with Eggplant, and Eggplant not only gives me the addresses those concerns that we come with a medical device as a medical device company, but also it lends itself, especially because it's a UI-driven testing tool, it lends itself to rapid development and just shoot small and get something going and start getting some ROI on that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to transition over to an Eggplant AI. So just a little reference here. What you just saw here was basically just functional driving an automation concept. And it took us through the treatment process, and you saw that. Now we're going to switch over to an Eggplant AI model that we have here. Okay, so there's the model. So in this model, admittedly, this model is not a super complicated model, and that's kind of why we picked it for talking about AI and our use of it here. And I'll just leave this up on the screen a little bit and kind of finish that narrative and how we got to AI here. So we got involved with using Eggplant, and it gave us the light footprint and all those other good things, and it's a pure UI-driven automation concept. And so we use it for some different things, including the automation that you were just looking at. So the value add that Eggplant gave us, just the core sense talk functional concept and the way it interacts with the systems under test, is also something that's a big win for AI. But AI takes the ROI concept. I think at least it has a great potential for this. It takes that ROI concept of we can build something quickly, shoot small, build something that's usable, we can start using it and see it give us value right back. It takes that almost to the next level because of the modeling concept and the way that you end up building little small pieces of code here and there, as opposed to building out the entire business logic within your code. So this thing was built, I'm pretty sure this was built in a matter of hours, and it really speaks to the ability with AI to build things out quickly. Now, the coding took obviously longer than that because we had to go through and actually build out the code and all the various aspects of the model. But it's a different way of, in some ways, it's definitely a different way of thinking. It's also the potential for building something quickly and getting people on board with how we're going to be testing something. It just feels like kind of a game-changing concept. Let me switch over here to the model. We can see it playing here. So again, this one is testing the login, and it goes down some different avenues. And the great thing here with a model like this is it has the potential of testing a bunch of workflows that we wouldn't normally test, or we would just take more time to get there. And so that's the beauty of AI, rapid development and the ability to get more greater coverage. However, one thing that we ran into, kind of a challenge in working with AI, is people tend to look at modeling in the same way that they would test manually. So in this particular model, we've already kind of worked ourselves out of that concept. You can see here that we're landing in some different, we have some different options here to go around and explore different functionality. Sometimes in the early development, we're pulling in our subject matter experts, and we're actually letting our subject matter experts, who are just, they're manual testers. They don't have, some of them have maybe a little bit of background in automation, but their big value add for the program on the automation side is that they're coming in as subject matter experts of our product. And they come in, they sit down, and they can build out these models. Again, like I said, this one was built in hours, I'm sure. We had some much more complex models that were built in a matter of a couple days. So going back to that challenge concept, a lot of times people, the people we brought in early for doing the model development, they would heavily sequence the actions within a state, and they would heavily sequence the states between state transitions. And we kind of want to push back on that and redirect that towards more of an open, let AI run around and cover a bunch of scenarios. And so that I would say that was one of our early challenges with AI in particular, was getting people to think a little differently on both sides. So on the automation, you have experienced automation on one side, they have to think differently. And then you also have your subject matter experts coming in, and there's a challenge sometimes to get them to think a little differently, to say, hey, don't think about it in terms of you're building out, let's say, just a model that's going to cover 2 or 3 use cases. Think about it in terms of what's the base functionality of the thing that you're testing, and build the model such that it could cover hundreds, even thousands of scenarios. And I think that's going to be the big benefit for using AI, is the ability to grow the coverage of the system under test. So thinking about some other things that have that we've run into, this is with functional and with AI in general. This is in the realm of best practices. So one of the best practices that we believe in as an automation team here in using the Eggplant products is we have a database set up that we're talking to. It's a metadata. It has a bunch of metadata, input data. It's also a place where we can store data. So that's 2 sides of using this database. One is an issue with our system, or I would presume with a lot of medical device systems, is we have data, and there's a transient nature to its usefulness at any given point in what we're in the process or the workflows of the things that we're testing. Okay, let me be very practical with what I mean by that. For example, we have a patient record. Maybe there's been a treatment plan that's been created, okay, so that they can be treated in our delivery system. Once the plan is pulled into the delivery system and treated, it can no longer be reloaded in the delivery system for treatment. So that creates a problem for automation testing. It creates a problem for any automation testing, obviously, because you need to be able to drive your automation with some data, and you need the automation to be intelligent to what it's doing at any given point in the product based on the data or the inputs that it's using. Okay, and so if your data has a life cycle, then you need to be aware of that. And for us, the best way to deal with that is to have a metadata database, as it were, where we can reference that and use that as input to drive automation. With AI, the problem kind of gets even bigger, because AI has the potential of running through so many scenarios, and ultimately that could result in it running through a lot of data in our test environment. So we have to be creative about solving that. Some of the creative options are things within our own product about ways we can test it so that we avoid moving the data through its life cycle entirely. But the other side of it is to stage data in our database and then run through it, so we have a lot of data-driven testing concepts. Another thing we landed on recently is Eggplant can talk to any database, and so we're going to have it talk directly to the product database. Well, in the test environment, of course, we'll have it talk directly to the test environment database and ask various questions so that it can automatically, on the fly, figure out which data would be useful for running the next scenario. Okay, so going back to that same use case that I was describing before, we could have it ask the database, essentially, do you have a patient that has a plan that's ready to be treated? And it can serve up that answer, and then it can just pick from that list and then pull that up in the delivery system and treat that patient. Okay, so that's one thing that it's been a challenge, and I think kind of leads to a best practice concept. So talking about AI again, I'll switch over back to this screen just to look at the interface. One thing that we've found, and this gets into challenges and best practices. Again, a challenge that we've run into is there's the potential in a stateful system of having a lot of variables in AI. Now, this is true whether you're, again, using functional alone or using AI. You have to be aware of state. In a system that has a lot of state issues, then you have to be aware of state in your automation, and that's going to lead to, in the case of AI, potentially a lot of variables. Now, some of those variables don't necessarily need to be at the model. So this kind of puts us in conflict with design philosophy in our use of AI. And we're still exploring where the balance is. One of our design philosophies is we want to pull as much logic out of the sense talk code, out of functional, and move it up into the model so that the model represents the logic of the automation as much as possible. However, that's not always practical for any given testing situation. It also poses a problem for variables because we have so much input data. Just doing one thing in, say, the treatment planning software that we have or the treatment delivery software, either one of those can present a whole list of things. You might have a whole list of inputs that you need to know and are going to drive very specific behaviors in the automation based on what those data points are. So right now, Eggplant AI doesn't have an object that can encapsulate all that in a variable. So what we found is in order to have a good balancing act, we're pushing some of those variables that we would probably like to have up in AI. We're pushing them into sense talk, and we're handling them down there where we can encapsulate them and handle them a little better so that we don't have literally a laundry list of dozens of variables up in AI. That gets a little overwhelming when you're working with the model, especially when you get into maintenance. Coming back to a model, looking at it, understand why, and how are they being used in the model, and how can I tweak this model to make something else happen with it? I think this is an area of opportunity for Eggplant, and we're looking forward to. We just got the new version. We're downloading it this afternoon, and we're going to put it in. The big feature we're looking forward to is the models in models, as well as the versioning, the kind of an early versioning concept that's being implemented. But beyond that, we see a lot of opportunities for AI in the future, and this is no slight to AI. It's an awesome product. It's also a big opportunity as you guys develop it and build it out and make it mature for customers like us, which I think kind of gets back to, really does get back to the medical device concept here. I'll reflect on that a little bit here. Medical devices bring some challenges, and Zach, you did a great job of hitting a lot of those points. I think, though, that one area that we've run into is the traceability to requirements. That's a problem in any automation space, but it is one that we're looking forward to creatively solving in AI over the future. Also, we run into issues of reporting and validating our usage of the tool, et cetera, just the whole gambit. We've worked through some of these creative. The core for us is what AI is doing, and its capability is to drive additional coverage and ultimately to find more defects, which right now we're kind of hanging our hat on that. And and I think it's a good peg to hang your hat on, which is, hey, we're going to add more value using this product, and we'll deal with the regulatory side of things as we go. We'll just get more value from testing, and then we'll continue to lean on the manual testing for discrete coverage of every requirement. But that's an area where we definitely want to drive towards with our automation, and that's something that people are very interested in, right? They want to see that we're building automation that can, on one hand, supplement regression, and then at some point start to reduce the amount of regression time that needs to be done with manual work, and that will obviously lead to a lot of good results from a return on investment perspective. It also has the huge potential of reducing testing timeframes over time as we broaden our automation coverage. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our experience with the Eggplant products and with QualiTest, and I hand it over to Mike.
So Paul, thank you very much for the assistance and the really great presentation that you gave today. And Zach, same to you. I think it's been very meaningful and very useful to this point. What I wanted to do was to kind of go over some of the ideas and how we apply them technically with Eggplant. Now, the future of medical devices is evolving very, very quickly. And I think, as you've heard from our other panelists today, that really what it's coming down to is how do I keep up with being able to test medical devices so they do no harm to others and deliver the proper results, while at the same time evolving with the technology. And really, Eggplant is the premium and optimal solution to do this. So a little bit about it before we begin. Eggplant itself was founded in 2008, 600 customers, and a lot of our customers are focused in two areas. The first one is healthcare. So we handle a lot of the EMR and EHR systems out there. But really, we also have another strength in defense and aerospace. So we do a lot of work for government. We also do a lot of work for a lot of contractors, as you can see, companies like Northrop, Lockheed, Raytheon. And this is because of the non-invasive nature of Eggplant Functional. You can see us being able to test any system under test, any platform, any application, but at the same point in time, do so like the user does. So this allows us to do things like help NASA test their navigation systems for the Orion space module, and also all the way to helping our military develop next generation technologies. So we're actually starting to be recognized for these capabilities in the industry. As you can see, we are rated #1 in the Forrester Wave. And really, this is because not just of the technology that we have underneath everything, it's really because of the ability for us to deliver on the vision and really talk about customer business outcomes. So when a lot of companies are looking at quality assurance and testing, they're looking at it, all right, does the system perform under test as it's supposed to? What Eggplant does is they look at it like, all right, if I am in a medical device context, having to record my findings and send them to the hospital from home, or if I'm a nurse trying to operate 5 different IV systems, how can I do that? Is the application working for me like I need it to work, not necessarily matching up with what a good requirement looks like? And the way Eggplant does this is by focusing on 2 areas. The first is the digital automation intelligence. That is really the idea where there's the intelligent test automation through Eggplant AI. There's a universal fusion engine, which allows us to test anything. So this means multiple technologies within the same test case or even the same AI model. Full CX testing, functional testing, performance testing, usability testing, and also release insights. Digital automation intelligence is what you saw earlier with Accuray, as they were able to do hardware, physical testing, and software testing with the, using the AI model. This is different than what a lot of other testing tool companies do there out in the market. They say, all right, we'll do medical device testing, but it'll just be supply chain management. Does my SAP instance work right? Am I tracking inventory correctly? Eggplant can do that, but what we're also doing is looking at the way the physical machines operate and how we can handle those. The second thing that Eggplant does to create what we call the customer experience optimization suite is we have something called CXI, Customer Experience Insights. And that is really around monitoring, delivering insights, predictive analytics, and business impact. So from a medical device perspective, we can actually tell you if the nurses, doctors, patients are getting frustrated trying to enter into a system, or if you're expecting X, but it's taking longer or shorter for the user to use it. And what this does is this answers the age-old question that every quality assurance person has ever had, which is, can my automation and my testing take into account what the tester and the user are actually doing? And so the user can work on their devices. That session information with Eggplant is brought into the Eggplant AI engine and executed. And as you'll see a little bit later on, all of these areas between requirements analysis, and bugs, and coverage analysis, and just simple ad hoc testing, and what the user journeys are doing are all fighting for a spot to be executed. So the automation challenges tackled with Eggplant really, and this is one of the strengths of the tool, is the ability to be able to test fragmented technologies, mainframes, voice and touch ID, omnichannel, DevOps, anything you see, digital, non-digital interactions, custom devices. As long as it has an API, as long as it has a user interface, as long as you can use it, Eggplant can use it. And this is the real strength when it comes to medical device testing. As you know, patients want more control of their outcomes. They want to be able to interface with systems. They don't want to be in hospitals. How are you going to test that? You can test it in the lab and with emulators, or you can spend a lot of money and do it through field testing and in the wild testing. But really where the evolution is going is to have the ability for an AI engine and a fusion engine like what Eggplant has, and be able to do that in-house. So this really comes down to what are the 5 forces of Eggplant? It comes down to customer experience insights, UX testing and monitoring, the universal fusion engine, intelligent automation and release insights. Really what this means is that if I'm doing it on the screen, if I'm doing it to the system or the medical device, that can be a test case to Eggplant. The power here is that technically to make this happen, the 2 keys on the screen are going to be the intelligent automation and the universal fusion engine. The intelligent automation, when you think, I'm sure you've heard AI in testing, AI in general, and I know that if you were to ask a show of hands, what does AI mean? Your 5 people are going to have 5 different answers for what that is. In our case, what we're saying for AI is that we're looking at it like an exponentially faster test manager. Testing was built upon 3 things, really. It was modularization, parameterization, and it was also upon being able to pick the right test cases to execute at the right time for the right strategy. This is what Eggplant AI does. It picks the right test cases to use. It uses full modularization, and it uses full parameterization to be able to increase the number of permutations and combinations that you can test. If you remember what Paul said during his part of the presentation, one of the biggest issues he's run into with AI is the fact that they're running out of data faster. This is what happens. This is actually, it's a good and bad problem to have. And so when looking at it for healthcare, just taking you through a quick example here, is that you can tap into the domain expertise from the AI engine. That's really where your business analyst, your designer is creating the AI model. The automation team is creating snippets 5 to 10 lines long. These are more or less automation functions. You do non-invasive automation through Eggplant Functional, being driven by Eggplant AI. Using our Eggplant Network Suite, you can simulate network conditions. And this is really helpful if you have medical devices that need a cellular or a cable or FiOS type of connection to be able to connect back to either the EMR, EHR, or the central housing system. Integrates with different systems like HIPAA, and so we can be fully FDA compliant. We can follow HIPAA. We can follow all the privacy regulations and rules. And also we're able to predict the likelihood of a successful system launch. Remember, getting defects and preventing them from coming to production is only part of the battle now. The other part is making sure the users love, enjoy using your product. It's measuring the customer delight. So really the strength that we have is by doing this at Cerner, we're able to accelerate the delivery by 23%. But what that also means is that we've got the full end-to-end interoperability and accessibility of their EHR program and platform tested. And what that means to a medical device company is that you're using something like Canvas. It's easy for us to be able to simulate those devices as long as they're next to each other, or maybe you move it farther away. So it's inside the controlled area network, or it's not inside the controlled area network. We can test whether or not your medical device is interfacing with that EMR, EHR. But then the other question, this is kind of what you saw with Accuray, is we have another example with Walmart where we can actually control robots to do the robotic testing against in this case, it's a point of sale machine. But this could be anything. This could be, an IV tube. This could be a blood pressure monitor. This could be anything. And so one of the things, too, as we talk about this with the Eggplant suite, is that there is a lot of issues and things that we can do. There are 5 areas where Eggplant really joins in. The first one is going to be around, the user journeys. There's another one around coverage analysis, bug hunting, riffing, or ad hoc testing. And as you can see here, the model is actually traversing and executing all these things where each of these conditions are fighting over it. So this is really AI in action. And really what it's going to come down to is, for the future of medical device testing, is how are you ensuring patient accessibility? How are you ensuring interoperability? How are you ensuring that the patient and the doctor and the nurse and the provider is having a positive experience? And how are you able to test all the different platforms that are coming, not just supply chain, but also IoT, also tablets, mobile devices, whatever the situation calls for? How are you going to be able to do that? And so with that, what I'd like to do is hand it over for some questions and hopefully provide you some more insight. So thank you.
Okay, so we got a list of questions from the audience, and given time constraints, we can only get to a few of them. But really, the best way to do it is to, we'll read them off, and anyone can jump in and answer them. Once again, Paul and Zach, thank you so much for the really meaningful content. It's been an interesting dialogue, and I think that a lot of our audience members are going to find it particularly useful. So the first question comes in, and it says, what products do we need to do, or what products do we need to do what we saw in the demo? And really, it comes down to two. The first one, as Paul mentioned, was Eggplant Functional. The second was Eggplant AI. We call this the DAI suite. Very easy to implement, short learning curve, and has a robust history of working on any and all devices and platforms.
Just to touch on that, this is Zach here. For QualiTest, we did not have anyone that had Eggplant experience for a while. When we first got our demo, it took me a couple days to get ramped up, and then it took me a couple more days to get they have a certification course. They have 2 certifications for functional. It took me 2 days to get that, and I was already feeling like I didn't need much else help, and there's plenty of documentation online. So not to toot their horn too much, but it's very well documented and really easy learning curve.
Yeah, I would second that. Yep, just jumping in here, seconding that as a customer, working with QualiTest, and it was really good ramp up. We had no Eggplant experience across the board, and we ramped up a team in months, over the course of months.
Great. And I think the next question, I'll step out of this one, but for Paul and Zach, this one would be for you, is do you find automation helping or hurting in FDA regulated environments?
I can give a general answer, Paul, but I think maybe a specific answer, since you would be the client, would also be helpful. So just briefly, I think it is helping. I myself have worked in an FDA regulated environment before on a medical device company that does surgeries on knees. And I found a majority of my work was manual paperwork and repetition of the same test case over and over and over again. Having automated testing is very good to have.
So yeah, I would jump in here as well and say that I'm not sure that I could see really a scenario where automation would hurt in an FDA regulated environment. I mean, certainly there's risks in all the testing, not in all the testing that we do, but there are ultimately patient risks that exist in our product. And so when we're testing, we want to make sure that we're addressing those risks. So I would see the only potential there would be if someone were to rely on automation maybe too much and take skilled, intelligent people out of the testing equation, but that's not our intent. And right now, I would even go so far as to say that our automation efforts are very much an adjunct to all of our manual testing. And we envision the day, as I alluded to earlier, when we want to see automation taking on more of the regression. But right now, when we have automation there in place to do regression, it's really additive. We're just doing more regression cycles where we wouldn't maybe have had the opportunity to do them before. before. Now we're doing more regression cycles earlier on in the development cycle. So that's where I see automation really helping is, and this is true really to any company, is doing regression cycles earlier, getting them in earlier. The other place where I see automation helping is doing testing that is hard to do or even maybe impossible to do with manual testing, right? So there are scenarios where it would be just human resource prohibitive to say we're going to do X or Y or whatever the scenario is, and we're just going to run that thing over and over again thousands of times. And we're just going to vary the input by 0.1 of whatever every time, right? So that would be a scenario where you would say, hey, that's an obvious opportunity for automation. And so that's some of the low-hanging fruit that we've had is some test case scenarios, some testing scenarios where we literally wanted to do the same thing over and over again for the sake of testing a particular set of our components, just to see how they work over a span of time, over projected simulated usage model, right, or amount of usage, I should say. So that's been opportunities, and so I don't think it could really hurt too much unless you made, I would say, really bad decisions to rely on automation where you really need to be making sure that intelligent and informed and experienced and trained people are looking at things.
Great, thank you for that answer. Third question comes in as, can these techniques also be used in robotic process automation? And from an eggplant perspective, yes. What we find is a lot of our customers will use AI and eggplant functional to do a lot of the repetitive tasks associated with RPA. So while not a straight up RPA tool, eggplant can do the job. So next question. Can eggplant be used in testing CAN bus test cases? And I'll take that one too. So yes. Generally what's happened is that we're seeing a lot of integration between Cerner, Epic, a lot of the EMR and EHRs and the medical devices, just because there's so much of a diversity in the ecosystem. And especially what you saw in Paul's demo with eggplant control of multiple devices, that's essentially how we would work. And we can make sure that the device is in range, out of range. We could make sure the devices are updating each other properly. So yes, all that can be done. Generally, it just comes to, the only limits are really what the creativity and the test situation calls for. So I would say about 90% of the situations you deal with, eggplant can be used. Now, the next question that came in, I'm going to modify it a little bit and kind of throw it out there to Zach and Paul. And the question is can automated test cases be used to train the service technicians doing the implementation work? So I guess that means if they throw it out and they're deploying it on the street, can automated test cases be used as a training mechanism?
So yeah, I'll start. The simple answer is yes. Every automated test should come from some form of a manual test or some workflow. So, and if that's not the case, then you have a bad test. So what you're going to want to first look at is some sort of documentation within that automated test, whether you're using BDD and you have a feature file with the steps in there to follow, or if you're using keyword-driven testing, looking through the keywords that are being used, you can parse through the information that you need in order to train people. You're also able to use the reporting and the logs. So I do think it's not only a usable, but it's I think it's good practice to, in conjunction with manual test cases, show the automated scripts to train people.
So this question probably comes a little bit early in our use of automation, and so I haven't given that too much thought, to be honest. It does seem like an interesting proposition. I'm not sure if putting the automation in front of the technicians is the right answer, but it does open up, I think, additional questions about what could service technicians do with automation. I think that's also there. But as far as training them, certainly, having the automation recorded and people being able to look at what came out of it, could be very useful. And then I would see if we're going to do automation for training service technicians that we probably would gear the automation itself specifically for a presentation to the service technicians. Again, leaning back on what Zach said, of course, we would want to be following some workflow that is clinically relevant, but we would focus on relevant workflows for the service technicians.
Great, thanks. Next question is, and I'll throw this to Paul and Zach again, is what are the best practices to follow if I'm just starting medical device automation?
I think the most important area is not even necessarily automation. It's knowing all the processes and all the documentation surrounding the testing effort. I think one big mistake that people normally make is just jumping into automation with no plan. So if someone's starting out, they're just brand new, best practice would be to learn everything you can from whatever SME there is, whether that be the technician, whether that be someone who operates the medical device. I would gather as much information for real life use cases, maybe for test cases they have. I would read them, I would dry run them. So that would be what I would suggest. And then also whatever documentation you can find on gaps, coverage, if there's any risk registry, if there's a defect list, and some sort of defect tracking tool. Learn as much as you can before you even start writing the script would be my advice.
Yeah, that sounds like good stuff, Zach. And I would add to that by just kind of reflecting on our experience a little bit, and just say, certainly you want to have goals, and Zach, you alluded to that, and I would say look for automation opportunity. I would reflect, I am going to gear my answer straight towards like automation here and say I would look for automation opportunities that, again, going back to the earlier discussion, not that it would be cost prohibitive or resource prohibitive to try to do something manually. Look for opportunities that are value add for automation. And that, again, that's a concept that's true for any company, but you get the same thing in the medical device arena, and people are very focused on return on investment. So I would definitely look to set some goals and some target concepts for automation. Build your team. Here on this point, I would say don't go big at the beginning. Find a core team of automation engineers. I don't know what the right size for any given company would be. But my default would generally be in the 2 to 3, maybe 4 people range, and then build from there quarter over quarter, so that you don't overextend yourself. And then again, you're going to have questions on the ROI. And if you have a huge team and you end up with any kind of hurdles or roadblocks, then if people are spinning their wheels, et cetera, then it's going to be hard to make your ROI argument. From there, lay out a plan, work towards that plan. Finally, don't get hung up on the tooling. Don't get hung up on the technology, I meant to say. And I think Eggplant really fits in there. Not to, I know it. You guys are doing this Eggplant webinar, and I'm not here to. I want to be objective in this discussion. However, I'm definitely a big proponent of Eggplant and the tooling because of the fact that it's technology agnostic. It could work on different OSs and softwares. And so to that point, I think that was one of our big wins. It moved over to Eggplant was not getting hung up on the technology and letting technology become this big research project.
Great, thanks. And then we've got time for one more question. And it is a question to Zach and Paul. What do you see as the 2 biggest challenges to testing medical devices? I guess this would be both automation and manual.
So I touched on this in my slides, but it's worth going over again. I actually had a couple challenges, but if I had to narrow it to 2, my biggest ones would be burnout and user error. And those kind of not complement each other. Those are kind of integrated. But the reason I think those are the biggest issues is because with burnout, if you hire a resource, like was said in the webinar earlier, and you have that person running permutations in the millions, they're going to burn out real quick. Once they burn out, we're going to start seeing errors. We're going to start seeing shortcuts. And especially when testing medical devices, there's really no room for cutting corners. I mean, that's the whole reason we have so many audits, is to make sure that we're not doing that. So my suggestion, well, since we're looking at both the manual and an automated sense, automated is going to solve a lot of that issues for you, because I mean, look, there's always a need to have manual testing, but you just got to know your limitations, the limitations of humans in general. We have short attention spans, and automation test cases don't. So I think those are the two biggest challenges from my perspective.
So I'm going to ramble on a little bit here and put in some different pauses maybe. So the two biggest challenges facing medical device testing, I would say, honestly, there's a lot of challenges. And so it's hard to really hone in on two of the biggest ones. I think one thing that gets in the way is it's easy to get hung up on the regulatory side of things and lose sight of we're trying to add value for actual quality of the product. So I think in that domain, one big answer is to get a driven testing approach, and this is not automation. I am an advocate for automated testing, but here I'm advocating having a tool, a validated tool that manages your testing for you and allows you to go fully electronic in your record keeping, because otherwise you just have these mounds and mounds of paper that people have to carry around. And I've back in the early days of my medical device experience, I would remember these binders, these enormous 5-inch binders, just huge, packed full of paper, and so the regulatory side can be burdensome. It feels like at times. It's there for a purpose, and I think the answer to it is not to look at it as a burden per se, but to find efficient ways to meet those requirements and to leverage the strength of having those regulations. The other side would be, I think, just there's always things that get in the way. And this is probably true in anywhere you go, but I'm reflecting here specifically on automation when I think about this. It's easy to let a lot of stuff get in the way, and this is again why I say start small, have some well-defined goals that leverage automation effectively, and then push for those, because it's easy to let, especially in the regulated environment, it's easy to let a lot of concerns get in the way, and you definitely want to be cognizant of those concerns. You don't want to just ignore them. However, those concerns sometimes can manifest into unnecessary roadblocks. And so I think a big thing in the medical device arena with automation is try to push through and find a way to get some ROI and build up the concept of, because I think this is the big thing in the medical device arena when people think automation, or again, I'll say this is true in any arena, but it happens in the medical device arena. People are thinking about how do we replace manual testing with automation. I don't think that's an overbearing goal necessarily for automation, especially in the early stages. But that sometimes that point becomes an objection, because there are so many hurdles in a regulated environment to have automation somehow replace any amount of manual testing, that I would argue don't even try to shoot for that initially. Just shoot for getting valuable feedback from your automation tests so that you're seeing more bugs and you're finding them earlier.
Great. So I think that's all the time we have. So, Lexi, I'll throw it back to you. And, Zach and Paul, I personally want to thank you for helping us out with the webinar today. So, Lexi, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mike, Paul, and Zach, for your excellent presentations. And thank you to everyone who joined us here today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to follow up with you personally to provide an answer your way. Or if anything else comes up in the meantime, please feel free to visit us at eggplant.io or qualitestgroup.com. We look forward to seeing you at the next event.